Thank you, Mike. And I have no analogy for you. Yeah, we got a chart. The conclusion of this, and I think this is concluding, I think this bill is dead, is unfortunate. Because every Republican I know serving in Congress wants to secure the border. And we had a real opportunity to do so. Democrats wanted funding for Ukraine. A lot of Republicans do as well. I think most of our fellow citizens want to help the freedom-loving people of Ukraine. But there are issues involved in that. But we had an opportunity to use the President's desire for funding for Ukraine to actually secure the border. The challenge for Republicans in this process was that Democrats actually want an open border. Certainly the President does. Most of the Democrat members of Congress want an open border. And they caused this process. I've been saying for quite some time now that negotiating with them on this issue is like negotiating with an arsonist to put out the fire that arsonist set. So what we should have done is we should have, first of all, had trust in the American public who, by and large, agree with us. They recognize the open border is a clear and present danger to America, to its citizens, and they want to secure the border. So we should have had faith in them, and we should have had a very open process. And I would suggest what we should have started with is somewhat like Speaker Johnson has started, is he lays out all the authority that the President currently has to secure the border. The Supreme Court ruled on the Immigration and Naturalization Act that it exudes deference to the executive. Then we could have pointed to different areas of different court decisions that have weakened that authority, and we could have corrected those. The Republicans would have happily given the President Biden the authority that he now says he wants. I don't believe him. But we would have been happy to give him that authority to actually secure the border because that's what we want. The problem with this bill, and it's kind of demonstrated in this chart here, is it codifies an awful lot that we don't want. It normalizes thousands of people a day. It probably undermines a future president's ability to secure the border by having things like a discretionary threshold of 4,000. Well, what if you have a president in the future that wants to secure the border before it reaches 4,000? Have you undermined that president's ability? The fact that discretion to close the border ends after 3 years could also be used by liberal groups against a conservative president who wants to secure the border by saying, well, you thought you had that authority under the INA, but Congress didn't think you had it, so they passed this bill and they only gave the president that authority for 3 years. So the real tragedy of this process is that what the American people want, they're not going to get. And there was no reason for it. And the bill that was produced, and I think we all have a great deal of appreciation and sympathy for James Langford, who is knowledgeable about this, worked his tail off. But he was just facing that insurmountable hurdle of dealing with and negotiating with people that want an open border. It didn't work. Because that bill, in the end, would have probably done more harm than good by normalizing a flow of illegal immigration and undermining a future president who actually wants to secure the border. Quick shifting to Ukraine. I agree with my colleagues who are complaining about the process internally in our conference. As a conference, leadership needs to listen to its members. In this case, had leadership listened to us and insisted on tying Ukraine funding to meeting thresholds, we might have had a bill we could support. Right now, I think Republicans, as you heard Senator Scott say, our constituents are concerned about inflation, which is caused by too much deficit spending. We spend well north of $870, $80 billion a year in defense a year. Now they want to spend another $110 billion. At a minimum, we should pay for it. There's got to be some dollars, for example, in all the green energy boondoggle spending, that we can rescind to pay for security for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan. So the principal position of the Republican conference in the Senate should be, we may or may not support funding for Ukraine, but if it's going to be given, it ought to, at a minimum, be paid for because we have to stop mortgaging our children's future. I'll turn it over to Senator Cruz. It's just a question, but I think it's a pretty legitimate question. So, President Biden opens up the border. He exposes America to these threats, a clear and present danger. He did it, and members of the administration carry on the drumbeat of President Trump's secure border. It was so inhumane. It was so inhumane to enforce the law. It was so inhumane to stop, or certainly slow, dramatically slow, the trafficking of humans, the sex trafficking, the drug trafficking. The fact of the matter is, this explosion of illegal immigration, President Biden and his Democrat colleagues here in Congress, who also want an open border, who also caused this problem, their open border policy is facilitating the multi-billion-dollar business model of some of the most evil people on the planet. The drug traffickers, over 100,000 overdoses, primarily fentanyl. The human traffickers, the sex traffickers. How do you think these young women pay off their $7,000 to $10,000 to $15,000 human trafficking fee? They involuntarily get put into the sex trafficking business. There's nothing humane about President Biden and the Democrat in Congress's open border policy. It is grotesquely inhumane. I mentioned drug trafficking. A few years ago, certainly in Wisconsin, I think this is all over the nation, a big problem was methamphetamine labs. So dangerous labs, but sprinkling up all over in little towns, big towns, all over the country. That's not a problem for law enforcement anymore. Because as President Biden and his Democrat colleagues in Congress, their open border policy, now methamphetamine is so cheap coming in the southern border, those meth labs have been put out of business. I recently sat down with the sheriffs in Winnebago and Fond du Lac County. They were talking about the drug trafficking and the explosion of it in the Biden administration years. They described how prior to the Biden administration, there was a hub of drug trafficking in Chicago, and the branches split out from there into Wisconsin. Now what's happened, the drug trade is flourishing to such a degree, now Wisconsin has hubs with branches springing out from those hubs as well. And again, I mentioned all the overdose deaths, the tragedies facilitated by the open border policy. This chart is historical up to this point. This is a line from December of last year, when in one day we experienced 14,509 migrants flooding our border. It averaged over 10,000 people a day. Since the start of the Biden administration, on average, the average has been over 7,000 illegal immigrants per day, every day, since President Biden entered office. I remember back then, during Trump's crisis, there'd be reports of these huge caravans of a couple thousand people. That used to be big news when President Trump was president. A couple thousand in a massive caravan. Now 7,000 a day barely is ever reported on. In fact, the only reason the current crisis is being reported on, the only reason President Biden and his colleagues, Democrat colleagues in Congress, their open border, is getting a light shined on it now is because you have mayors like Mayor Adams in New York and Mayor Johnson in Chicago, sanctuary cities, proud to be a sanctuary city, come one, come all of a sudden found out it's not a very good idea. Mayor Adams dealing with less than 2%, about 110,000 of the 6 million people, less than 2% of those illegal immigrants led in by Joe Biden and his Democrat colleagues here in Congress is going to destroy New York City. Mayor Johnson has similar comments in Chicago. So the media is forced to report that. They don't want to. They would like to keep covering up for the president, but the conditions have gotten so bad that even the mainstream media, the liberal, the biased, the cover-uppers for President Biden have to report on this. And so now, more Americans are awakened to this clear and present danger. Well, first of all, thank you, Senator Marshall, for sponsoring this press conference. Thanks to all of you for coming here. And I want to thank the legal minds of our conference for kind of laying out the case of why we must hold a trial. I'm going to make the practical case. The reason Chuck Schumer wants to table it is this chart. I was with President Trump last week, traveling with him. Of course, we talked about the border. And I showed him this chart that I've been developing since I was chairman of Homeland Security, probably in 2014 and beyond, just updating it monthly. The disaster that was deferred action on childhood arrivals, which sparked this massive, under a Biden, invasion of our country. President Trump liked the chart, and he adapted it. He modified it for his own use. It's gotten more publicity as a result. I'm shocked. But one of the commentators, one of the political commentators, retweeted that chart and said, this will itself decide the election. That's why Senator Schumer does not want to hold this trial. I've made one additional modification. By the way, what I like about this chart and what I've tried to describe here is the cause and effect. You know, starting with DACA, the reinterpretation of the Flores decision, the fact that President Trump was faced with his own border crisis, but he fixed it. You'll notice his peak, a little under 5,000 people a day on average being encountered at the southern border. Within 12 months, he had reduced that down to about 500 a day. Now, that was before Title 42. What I've added to the chart now is expulsions under Title 42. So even though single adults started increasing in about May of 2020, during the election year, because Democrat presidential candidates were vowing they would end deportation, they'd provide free health care. That was an incentive. That's the problem. The Biden administration, Democrats, they are incentivizing the invasion of this country. So more people started coming. But because of COVID, President Trump invoked Title 42. And he started expelling people. So you can see the incredibly small numbers of people under the Trump administration that President Trump allowed in this country. We had pretty well secured our border, setting up the next step of passing a functioning legal immigration system. I was working with Senator Lee and the Trump administration on that. We would have fixed these problems. But unfortunately, America made the wrong choice. They elected President Biden, and Democrats control the houses of Congress. And this is an important point to understand. Democrats, President Biden, want an open border. They caused this problem. We didn't need a law passed to have President Biden have the authority to close the border. President Trump, using existing law, closed the border. President Biden, using that exact same authority, opened it up. So you can see the explosion from the end of the end of the Trump administration, where virtually we had the border closed. And then the explosion and the widening gap as President Biden allowed Title 42 to expire. But even without that, even using Title 42, they welcomed, they incentivized families, unaccompanied children, and subjected them to the depredations. Their open border policy facilitates the multi-billion-dollar business model of some of the most evil people on the planet. The human traffickers, the sex traffickers, the drug traffickers, poisoning our cities. That's what Biden and the Democrats, and this is important to note too, it's not just President Biden. This is Democrat policies. That's what must be defeated. But Senator Schumer wants to nip this impeachment trial in the bud because he doesn't want the House managers to make the case, to explore exactly what happened, how their actions, how their policies are causing this invasion. They don't want to be held accountable. That's why a trial is imperative in the United States Senate and why I so appreciate what Speaker Johnson apparently just announced, that he's going to delay delivery of these things so that Senator Schumer doesn't have Thursday at 1 o'clock to just snuff this thing out. So again, thank you, Senator Marshall. Thank you all, and Senator Schmidt.
Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wisconsin.
Mr. President, earlier today we heard a very convincing case laid out by the House managers of why the Senate should fulfill its constitutional duty and proceed to a trial on the impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas. If we were to hold that trial, and we should do so, this chart that I've been developing since I became Chairman of Homeland Security in 2015 would basically be the irrefutable DNA evidence of the crime. What I've tried to lay out in this chart is the cause and effect of an ongoing set of illegal immigration crises faced by the last three administrations. And so what I'd like to do briefly here on the Senate floor is go through that history dating back to 2012 and show the impact of certain actions, certain court decisions, certainly the lack of faithfully executing the law in this administration that has now resulted in an invasion of our countries. But let's go back to 2012. That's where this chart begins. Even before that, I had developed a chart just showing on an annual basis the number of unaccompanied children coming to this country, averaged for many years, somewhere between 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 a year. And then in June of 2012, President Obama issued his, what I would consider lawless, unlawful, deferred action on childhood arrivals. That is what has sparked all of the succeeding illegal immigration crises, is that unlawful order, which by the way, was a complete misuse of prosecutorial discretion, which is supposed to be meted out or administered on a case-by-case basis. And for the first time, President Obama, in his administration, granted prosecutorial discretion to hundreds of thousands of people. And the world took note. What happened over the intervening years then is people realize America's law has changed. And we had reports when people would come to this country illegally, they would get their notice to appear before an immigration court. Well, that was used by human traffickers down in Central America. They called that the permiso, their permission slip to come to this country. So a couple of years after that unlawful order, deferred action on childhood arrivals, President Obama faced his border crisis. He actually called it a humanitarian crisis when in May and June of 2014, they averaged about 2,200 encounters per day. 2,200. That seems like the good old days. That's that little bump in comparison to President Biden's crisis at the border. So President Obama actually took action. He started detaining family units with children that came across the border, and it worked. He brought down the number of people crossing this into our country illegally because there was a consequence to it. Unfortunately, in February 2015, pro-immigration illegal immigration groups took the Obama administration to court under the Flores settlement, which basically back in the 1990s, there's a court case with a young immigrant girl named Flores, and the result of that settlement said that DHS could not hold an unaccompanied child for more than 20 days. Again, an unaccompanied child. So the Obama administration interpreted that, well, we can certainly hold a child when they're detained with their family. Well, these, again, pro-illegal immigration groups took the Obama administration to court, took Secretary Jay Johnson to court, and they reinterpreted the Flores settlement and said, no, you can't detain a child even if they're accompanied by their parents. And so the Obama administration faced a real decision. Should we detain the parents and release the child into HHS custody? They chose not to do that, except in some situations where they felt that wasn't a real family unit and that those parents may be a danger to that child. And you can see that the result of that, basically catch and release, is what that resulted in. And you can see the numbers start increasing prior to President Trump taking office. Now, if you remember, President Trump during his election made the open border, that catch and release, a huge issue in the campaign. And so when he got elected, again, the world noticed. They felt there's going to be a real crackdown on illegal immigration, and they stopped coming. There's a huge reduction from the end of the Obama administration to when President Trump first took office. But unfortunately, the law didn't change. That Flores reinterpretation stood. And so President Trump was faced with trying to figure out how can he utilize what laws existed, what authority he had, with no help from Congress, to address this situation. He wasn't able to address it immediately. And as a result, you can see the increase of not only single adults, but family units exploiting that provision, and unaccompanied children, to the point where in May of 2019, he hit his high point. Almost 5,000 people per day. But you'll notice President Trump did something about it. He enacted Migrant Protection Program. He instituted safe third country agreements with countries in Central America. He had to threaten the president of Mexico with tariffs so the president of Mexico would cooperate with us in securing our border. And over the next 12 months, President Trump, by and large, secured the border, to hit a low point in April of 2020 when a little more than 500 people per day were trying to come into this country illegally. Now, what President Trump also had starting in March of 2020 during the pandemic, remember, all of this reduction in illegal immigration occurred before the pandemic, but once the pandemic was in full swing in March and April of 2020, President Trump used his authority under Title 42 and used that health emergency to start deporting people coming to this country illegally. So you can see the very small, the purple bar are the people expelled using Title 42 authority. So even though the number of single adults was rising, by the way, the reason they were rising is during the presidential debate of 2020, every Democrat presidential candidate said they're going to end deportations and offer free health care. So again, that's a signal. The world listens to what elected officials or potentially elected officials say, and they believe them. They also believe their eyes when once people start coming in here, they're either detained and expelled or they're not detained. But anyway, so people started coming into this country again, assuming that President Biden was going to win the election and the border would be opened up. And of course, that's exactly what happened. Because once President Biden took office, he used the exact same executive authority that President Trump used. Let me just quick cover that. Even after the Flores reinterpretation, the Supreme Court, in a ruling in 2018, said that existing law, even though it was weakened by that reinterpreted Flores decision or settlement, that the current law exudes deference to the executive branch. President Trump used that deference. President Trump used that executive authority and pretty well closed the border. President Biden came into office and with literally hundreds of executive actions completely reversed President Trump's successful border security measures using that exact same presidential authority. All that deference. The point that's important to understand is President Biden wanted an open border. He caused this crisis. He could end it if he wanted to. He still has the authority. Republicans in the Senate would be happy to strengthen that authority, to overturn this Flores reinterpretation, which, by the way, Secretary Jay Johnson opposed that reinterpretation. He didn't like that court decision. So we would have been happy to strengthen President Biden's authority, but he doesn't really need us to secure the border. That's the point. And again, here's the DNA, the irrefutable DNA evidence of the crime. This didn't have to happen. President Biden didn't have to reverse President Trump's successful border security executive orders. But he reversed them and he opened up the border. And the result now is probably more than 6 million people have come to this country illegally and stayed. That's a number greater than the population of 31 states. That's the order of magnitude of the problem. The impact of this open border policy is devastating. It is a catastrophe. Not only does this open border policy facilitate the multi-billion-dollar business model of some of the most evil people on the planet, the human traffickers, the sex traffickers, the drug traffickers. How many hundreds of thousands of Americans have died of fentanyl overdoses? President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas said that they're reversing all of Trump's border security provisions because they said it was inhumane. There's nothing humane about facilitating human and sex and drug trafficking. And of course, the migrants coming in this country, it is true, Venezuela is emptying their jails, their mental institutions. There are some bad people, there are some criminals coming in this country, and of course we see evidence with these migrant crimes. Horrific crimes. People who no longer are alive because of President Biden's open border policies, because of Secretary Mayorkas executing President Biden's open border policies. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a prosecutor, but I believe it's a crime to aid and abet other crimes. So, from my standpoint, I think the House managers ought to be allowed to make their case. Again, they laid out the very compelling articles of impeachment today. It's a pretty simple case. It probably won't take that long of time for them to make their case, to present it for the Senate. Why won't Majority Leader Schumer allow the House managers to make their case? Why won't he allow the Senate to fulfill its constitutional duty to try impeachments? So listen, impeachments are not that regular. The least we can do is fulfill that constitutional duty and listen to the evidence. Allow the House managers to make their case. I think their case is overwhelmingly convincing. The repercussions of President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas' open border policy will be felt by Americans for years, if not decades, to come. About the only thing Congress can do when a president or a member of the executive branch is not faithfully executing the laws, when they're completely derelict in their duty, when their dereliction of duty or the lack of faithfully executing the laws is resulting in the deaths of Americans. Again, the open border policy is resulting in the deaths of American citizens. It's resulting in young women being forced into the sex trafficking trade. It's resulting in higher levels of fentanyl overdoses. That evidence needs to be heard. That case needs to be made. The Senate should hold a trial. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Titles of distinction. He is the Prince of Plastics, the maven of manufacturing, the connoisseur of cheese curds. He is also, among other things, someone who's identified himself as the Chancellor of charts, showing the profound depth of our border security crisis. He's been working on this ever since he first became the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee back in 2015. He's built on these charts, and he's built on them in a way that has resulted in them catching fire. You'll now see politicians all over the country at every level of government, and I mean every level of government, utilizing his charts because they're the best in the business. Let's hear from him now.
Well, I thank my colleague from Utah. I was not aware of all those titles, but I'll accept them. If we would have had a trial, and it's a travesty we haven't. I mean, there's been great damage done to our Constitution, to this institution, by our colleagues on the other side of the aisle because they didn't want the American people to see this. Now, I've described this chart. Had we had a trial, this would have been the irrefutable DNA evidence that proved the crime. There's no way you can take a look at the history of illegal entry in this country and not recognize that what has happened under the Biden administration, under Secretary Mayorkas, is nothing less than an utter catastrophe. Yesterday, I spent about 10, 15 minutes on the floor going through the history, the cause and effect that this chart shows. But what I really want to point out today is what the Democrats did not want us to reveal. Because what this chart shows is that this was purposeful. This was willful. President Biden, Secretary Mayorkas, our Democrat colleagues here in Congress and the Senate, they want an open border. They caused this crisis. This didn't just happen. This was a game plan that they implemented. They aided and abetted all the damage, all the destruction, all the crimes that result of this. They have aided and abetted it. What this chart does show is the lawlessness started back in 2012 under the Obama administration under the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This took prosecutorial discretion, which is, again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a prosecutor, but I believe that's supposed to be applied on a case-by-case basis. President Obama took prosecutorial discretion and granted it to hundreds of thousands of people. That is what has sparked every surge in illegal immigration since that point in time. I used to have a chart that just showed unaccompanied children. And prior to the DACA, it was maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 unaccompanied children per year that our federal government had to account for and had to deal with. In 2014, because of DACA, we encountered 69,000 unaccompanied children. 69,000. And even back then, President Obama, when his Department of Homeland Security, his Customs and Border Patrol were dealing with 2,200 illegal immigrants being encountered per day, he declared that a humanitarian crisis. 2,200 people a day. And by the way, I went down to McAllen, Texas, with a bunch of Democrat colleagues in February 2015 during this surge. And people were singing the praises of CBP, of kind of skirting bureaucratic rules and setting up a detention facility. They would protect children. They used chain link fences. Again, we were singing their praises. Democrats were singing the praises of CBP. A few years later, when President Trump had to deal with the crisis, again, sparked by the unlawful DACA memorandum, all of a sudden Democrats were saying it was kids in cages. Do you notice the double standard? I won't go through all the history, but I will point out President Trump, because the reality of the situation was we were letting children in, we couldn't detain them. You had the Flores reinterpretation that said that children, even accompanied by their parents, couldn't be detained. People around the world noticed that, so they started coming. They started creating fake families. Children are being sold, in testimony for my committee, children are being sold for $81. to create a family. A little boy was found abandoned in a field of 100-degree temperatures. He'd already been used. He created that family. The other people got in, and they just left him there. The only identification was a phone number written on his shoe. President Obama, Secretary Mayorkas, said they had to undo all of President Trump's successful border security provisions because they said those were inhumane. There's nothing humane about facilitating the multi-billion-dollar business model of some of the most evil people on the planet. The human traffickers, the sex traffickers, the drug traffickers. How many overdose deaths have we experienced throughout America because of this open border policy? There's nothing humane about that. When President Trump faced his peak, it was a sharp rise, but a sharp fall. In May of 2019, almost 4,800 people entered this country illegally. But President Trump did something about it. He used what the Supreme Court said in the 2018 decision, our existing law, that exuded deference to the president. So even though that presidential authority had been weakened somewhat by the Flores reinterpretation of that settlement, even with that weakened authority, President Trump took the bull by the horns, instituted Remain in Mexico, safe third world countries, had to threaten the president of Mexico with tariffs so he would cooperate. But in 12 months, President Trump went from his peak to his trough. A little more than 500 people a day entering this country. Now, what's interesting about this chart, that was, again, April of 2020. Why did the numbers go up? Pretty simple explanation. That was in the midst of a presidential campaign, and every Democrat presidential candidate pledged that they would end deportations, they'd give free health care. And the world took notice. People started coming in anticipation of President Biden taking office. And then once President Biden took office, the catastrophe began. And again, President Biden, now he claims he doesn't have the authority. No, he has all the authority that President Trump had to close the border. President Biden, Secretary Mayorkas, used that exact same authority purposefully, willfully, to open up the border. So President Biden didn't need more laws. Secretary Mayorkas didn't need more laws to fix this problem. They caused the problem. They have the authority. We would have been happy to strengthen the authority, to overrule the Flores reinterpretation. They weren't asking for that. All our Democrat colleagues wanted was political cover. That's the truth. So we went from a humanitarian crisis under Obama of 2,200 people a day. Trump had almost 4,800 people a day, but he fixed it. President Biden, his record is more than 10,000 people a day in December of last year. 10,000 people a day. During his entire administration, he's averaged 7,800 people in this country illegally because he has welcomed them. He's incentivized them. He wanted an open border. He caused this problem. And our Democrat colleagues would not even listen to evidence, would not let the House managers make their case of the lawlessness, of the willfulness, of the lying to Congress, because they didn't want the American people to see this. Now, I've shown this chart to Secretary Mayorkas. I'll show it to him again tomorrow when he comes before our committee. First time I showed this, a couple of years ago, it looked almost as bad. But I asked him, Secretary Mayorkas, don't you recognize this is a crisis? And this is what he's saying, we've got a secure border. He wouldn't say it's a crisis. Well, would you at least admit it's a problem? No, Senator, it's a challenge. Now, I would view that as a lie. I would have liked to have heard the evidence presented by the House managers of other instances where Secretary Mayorkas lied to Congress, which, again, as I thought was definitely pointed out by Senator from Louisiana, Isn't that a felony? And doesn't impeachment only have to be a misdemeanor? Again, so there's so much wrong in what our Democrat colleagues did today by just summarily, cavalierly dismissing these charges. It's going to come back to haunt our country. But my final point will be this disaster, it's on a chart. It's numbers. They're colors. But the real disaster is with the individuals who've lost their lives, who've lost loved ones. The children who have been raped, who've been caught in the crossfire of the gang wars. That's the real challenge, or that's the real catastrophe. That's the real problem. The Democrats just today swept under the rug. It's a travesty. It shouldn't have happened. But we'll continue to prosecute this case right up until November.
Grateful for those insights that we've had from our friend and colleague, the distinguished senior senator from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Emeritus. Mr. Secretary, you've seen this chart before. This chart not only shows just the undeniable reality of the catastrophe of your open border policy, but it also shows cause and effect. You know, dating back to 2012, the unlawful deferred action on childhood arrivals, that's what sparked all the subsequent crises. But I want to focus in the crisis that President Trump faced because of DACA, because of the reinterpretation of the Flores settlement. He was rapidly, the number of apprehensions or number of encounters at the border was rapidly increasing to peak in May of 2019 at about 4,800 per day. By the way, back in 2014, Obama hit his humanitarian crisis when you were part of, when he was Assistant Secretary, 2,200 a day. And President Obama called that a humanitarian crisis. But President Trump took action. He used the existing authority, although weakened by the Flores settlement reinterpretation, he used that authority and he secured the border. By April of 2020, we were down to a little over 500 individuals encountered at the border per day. 500, from almost 5,000. When you entered office, you reversed all those successful policies and you opened up the border and you've created this catastrophe, and it is a catastrophe. You know, 6 million people, more than 6 million people, the 31 states have a population less than the number of people you've let in, you know, flooding these sanctuary cities. So I've got a very simple question. Why did you do it?
Senator,
why did you reverse those policies? Why did you open up the border? Why did you create this catastrophe?
Senator, I respectfully disagree with the premise of your question. We did not open up the border. Senator, we enforce the law. We are facing—
Do you deny you reversed the Trump policies that had secured the border?
No, Senator.
You deny that?
No, Senator. That is not what I said. We enforce the law. We are dealing—
You reversed the Trump policies that had secured the border.
Senator, if we can look at your chart, I cannot see the bar graphs. Forgive me, the chair is blocking them. But the former president's Remain in Mexico policy was implemented in January of 2019, and 2019 saw an almost 100% increase in the number of encounters over 2018.
Mr. Secretary, it went down to 500, and then with COVID, he started expelling people under Title 42, which, by the way, you canceled, and you didn't have to do that. Let me ask you another question. Senator Paul was talking about Lake and Riley. I mean, I on the floor of the Senate, read a list of a dozen people in the last 4 months publicized murders, rapes, a 2-year-old caught in the crossfire, crimes committed by people in this country illegally. That had it not been for your reversing of the Trump policies, for your open border policy, those crimes would have been committed. I've got another simple question. Do you ever, when you go to bed at night, do you have any regrets? Do you have any remorse for your complicity,
Senator,
in these crimes? I mean, your open border policy is aided and abetted the murder of Americans, the rape of Americans. There are people have lost their loved ones because of this catastrophe, this open border policy. Do you have any remorse? Do you have any regrets?
Senator, 2 points. One, very importantly, all of our hearts break for the victims of these heinous crimes and their loved ones. Secondly, the criminals who committed those crimes are responsible for their criminal conduct.
They wouldn't have been into this country had you not allowed them in through your open border. Do you ever call up the families of the crime victims? Do you ever talk to Laken Riley's family?
Senator, as I stated previously, all of our hearts break for the loved ones of those who have been lost at the hands of criminal conduct.
Good. Okay, so your heart is broken. Do you have regrets? Do you admit your culpability here? Do you admit that your actions have resulted in the deaths and the murders and the assaults of thousands of Americans? I've got the CBP statistics here. Assault and battery up 5.7 times over the last few years what it was in 2020. Homicide up 17 times. Again, these are from keep people in this country illegally. Sexual offenses up 2.5 times. Again, that's the direct result of your actions, of President Biden's actions. Quite honestly, of actions of Democrats in the Senate who refused to vote to complete the wall, which would have helped. It's not the full solution. The full solution is actually having a president and Secretary of Homeland Security that wants a secure border. Our problem is we have a president, a Secretary of Homeland Security, Democrats in Congress, who want an open border that caused this problem, and they won't admit it. They won't admit it. President Trump had the authority, he used that exact same presidential authority to open up the border. Now you refuse to secure the border. And by the way, this bipartisan bill, let me paraphrase, pretty accurate quote of Senator Schumer to Politico. He said, we were playing chess, they were playing checkers, and we got our Ukraine funding. And we're in a lot better shape than we were 3 months ago on the border. You weren't negotiating to secure the border. You were negotiating for political cover for yourself, for President Biden, and for the Democrats in the Senate and Congress. That's what you were doing. You were not serious. If you were serious about securing the border, you could have done it. By the way, if you were serious about having a closed border, a secure border, you would have let it remain secure. You would have left those policies that worked, that secured the border, that would have allowed us to establish a functioning legal immigration system. But you blew it all up, and that's the result. That's the result. That's the catastrophe. And you've been denying before this committee repeatedly that this isn't even it's not even a problem, Senator. It's a challenge. This is a catastrophe, and I cannot believe you have no remorse.
Expired. Senator Langford.
Secretary Mayorkas, you and I have spent a lot of time together.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to speak to the same topic that my distinguished colleague from South Dakota was talking about. He called what was going to happen over the next couple of days here political theater. That's pretty accurate. Political stunt, political cover, a charade. Instead of actually securing the border, that's what Democrats in Congress, that's what President Biden, that's all they're interested in. Because as my colleague mentioned, President Biden has all the authority he needs to secure the border. But I want to spend a little bit of time here talking about the bipartisan bill that has been reintroduced, that we'll be voting on again on Thursday, although it failed very quickly because it literally was worse than doing nothing. But I think that the first point to be made is, so the American public understands, when President Biden and Democrats in Congress talk about securing the border, they're not talking about securing the border the way most Americans think about it, like actually securing the border. What they're talking about is how do we make it more efficient to encounter, process, and disperse illegal immigrants that are coming to this country with invalid asylum claims. How can we encounter them, process them, and disperse them as efficiently as possible. That is what they're talking about. So don't be fooled when they talk about securing the border. Proof positive of that is one of the lead Democrat negotiators in this bipartisan bill. Let me get the exact quote. He said, "The bill requires the president to funnel asylum claims to the land ports of entry when more than 5,000 people cross a day." Okay, that's not called securing the border. That's just sending the flow someplace else. And then the senator went on and said, "The border never closes." So again, when Democrats talk about securing the border, they're talking about more efficiently encountering, processing, and dispersing people. They're not talking about securing the border. And I want to start to prove my point that they were never serious in these negotiations, other than looking for political cover. This quote that the majority leader gave to Politico a day or two after that border bill failed. The majority leader said, quote, "We were playing chess, they were playing checkers, and we ended up with the Ukraine bill," Schumer said. He went on to say, "We also end up in much better shape on the border than we were 3 months ago." I'll come back to this, but let me make the points now. If you were really negotiating in good faith, if those negotiations failed, would you literally rub your negotiating partner's nose in the failure by claiming that we're playing chess, those knuckleheads were playing checkers, and we got exactly what we wanted? I would argue that is not the sign of a good faith negotiation. And then if you were really interested in securing the border, you would never make that statement. We ended up in better shape on the border than we were 3 months ago. Better shape on the border would have been actually past enhanced authority for the president to actually secure the border. The majority leader thinks he's in better shape on the border because he got the political cover he sought, which was his only goal in those negotiations. But let me spend just a little bit of time describing why that bill was far worse, and I mean far worse, than doing nothing. This is the border chart I've been producing since I became chairman of Homeland Security in 2015. It shows monthly totals of encounters on the southwest borders. And you can see back here in 2014, I've recreated that right here. You can see that President Obama, when he hit 2,000 people a day, declared that a humanitarian crisis, and President Obama was correct. It was a humanitarian crisis. Now, the solution back then was we started detaining people. We started clamping down. We built a new detention facility. And President Obama actually had success in reducing the flow until a court reinterpreted the Flores settlement agreement and said that that applied to not only unaccompanied children, forcing their release within 20 days, it also applied to children accompanied by their parents. That was the one court decision that did weaken a presidential authority. But the fact of the matter is, even with that weakened presidential authority, because of DACA, which sparked all this, and President Trump faced his border crisis, almost 5,000 people a day in 1 month, he used the presidential authority that the Supreme Court in 2018 decision talking about the Immigration Nationalization Act said that current law exudes deference to the president in every clause. It entrusts to the president decisions whether and when to suspend entry, whose entry to suspend, for how long and on what conditions. It thus vests the president with ample power to impose entry restrictions in addition to those elsewhere enumerated in the Immigration Nationality Act. So obviously, President Trump was able to use existing authority. He closed the border in 12 months. 12 months. Not through any help by Congress passing a law, by using that authority that the Supreme Court said the law exudes deference to the executive. Well, when President Biden came into office, he blew the border wide open. How? He did it by using that exact same executive authority that exuded deference to the president. He used that deference. He used that authority, and he blew open the border, and we see the catastrophe that has resulted. Now, the problem with this bill is it codifies most of President Biden's open border policy. It sets thresholds at 5,000, at 4,000. And I'll talk about those in greater detail. But thresholds to do what? Supposedly to secure the border. No, it doesn't really secure the border. Again, it sends those individuals to the ports of entry to have their asylum claims adjudicated in a Rube Goldberg type situation. It spends almost $20 billion, this bill. $20 billion. Primarily, again, to accomplish the Democrats' definition of securing the border, which is to more efficiently encounter, process, and disperse illegal migrants that do not have valid asylum claims. That's what this bill does. It builds more detention facilities. It hires a small number of Border Patrol agents, 425, but it hires over 4,000 asylum officers to, again, adjudicate these claims. And they use a new standard now. It goes from a significant possibility that these claims are valid to a reasonable. I'm sorry, I don't see much distinction there. So again, these asylum officers are going to be given all kinds of discretion, and these adjudications are now going to be done by asylum officers, not by immigration judges. So I see nothing in this bill that in any way, shape, or form forces a higher standard. It's all subjective. And under this administration, the subjectiveness of that, I can pretty well guarantee you, will continue the catastrophe. It pays for more detention beds. It pays for alternates to detention, which has never worked effectively. But again, $20 billion of money we don't have. Now, when President Trump secured the border, he didn't have additional funding for that. He didn't have additional Customs and Border Patrol agents. He used his policies. He used his executive authority. Remain in Mexico. You can't come to this country and claim asylum. You have to do it from your home country or stay in Mexico to do it. That was a huge deterrent, and the flow stopped. We had safe third country agreements. There are other things. Again, using that executive authority, he secured the border. We didn't need an immigration bill, certainly not this Rube Goldberg bill that spends $20 billion that we don't have. Rather than spending all that money to encourage more illegal immigrants come to this country, we ought to stop the flow, and then we wouldn't have to spend the money. Doesn't that make a whole lot more sense? Do what President Trump did. Actually stop the flow. But again, that's not what this bill does. I think the worst aspect of this bill, and this is why I always talk about it's worse than doing nothing, is not the 5,000 average migrants a day, which is, I mean, that's what this would look like if we just normalized 5,000 or 4,000. You're just codifying the open border. The 5,000 threshold makes it mandatory that the president supposedly secure the border. Again, it doesn't really define that. I would argue that doesn't even secure the border. But it's the 4,000 discretionary threshold that when average migration, I think over 7 days, reaches 4,000 a day, a massive number. Now the president, it says, has discretion to stop processing asylum claims and supposedly secure the border. Well, why is that problematic? Well, again, the Supreme Court said current law exudes deference. President Trump had the authority. By Congress passing a law basically implying that the president doesn't have the authority to stop processing asylum claims, you are weakening that authority. And even worse, that discretionary authority ends after 3 years. So that bipartisan bill would actually dramatically weaken the authority of a president who's actually serious about securing the border. That's why that bill had to be defeated and must be defeated now. It's not a serious attempt. It's a bill that was negotiated in bad faith, with the Democrats supposedly playing chess, and unfortunately our side playing checkers. Now, again, it doesn't have to be this complex. Use current authority. Take a look at what President Trump. Do that. Don't spend additional money. Stop the flow. That ought to be our goal. So again, most Republicans in the Senate conference, we weren't looking for an immigration bill. We certainly weren't looking for one that weakened the president's authority. We would have been happy to strengthen the president's authority. We'd have been happy to clarify. By the way, Obama's Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, completely disagreed with the court decision on the Flores settlement. We'd be happy to clarify that no, Flores only applies to unaccompanied children. So we have that deterrence. We could follow the law to detain people that came to this country illegally. We'd be happy to strengthen authority. What we were looking for in a border bill was to have an enforcement mechanism that would force President Biden to use the authority he has to actually secure the border based on our definition of securing the border. The way most Americans view securing the border. Stop the flow of illegal migrants that has caused a clear and present danger to this nation. I mean, I could go through the list of horribles: the drug traffickers, the human traffickers, the sex traffickers, the members of some of the most brutal gangs in Mexico, South and Central America, the military-aged men that are coming to this country. We are going to be dealing with this catastrophe for decades. For decades. The rapes, the murders, they're being committed by people in this country that shouldn't be here. This has been facilitated by this open border policy. Again, Republicans would be happy to strengthen the president's authority to actually secure the border. What we're not happy to do is engage in this charade. And let me end on this note. Again, is this the quote of someone who has entered into good faith negotiations to develop a bill to actually secure the border? This is the majority leader of the Senate, the one who is going to engage in political theater again this week, bringing up the exact same bill that has already failed. It failed in the eyes of the public within 24 hours after introduction. It was so bad. It was worse than doing nothing. But the majority leader seemed to be pretty happy with that failed bill. To quote, "We were playing chess. They were playing checkers, and we ended up with the Ukraine bill." That's what they wanted. Their primary focus, their priority, was providing $60 billion to a bloody stalemate, which, by the way, a couple days after that thing passed, the administration was already indicating, well, that's probably not going to be enough. Even though a majority leader came out of the White House and said, this is simple. Ukraine gets $60 billion, they win. If they don't get $60 billion, they lose. This is a disingenuous quote of a bad faith negotiating partner. But it's also the quote, if you look at the last sentence there, of somebody who's not looking to secure the border, but was looking for political cover. That's all he wanted. That's all the Democrats wanted. That's all President Biden wants. Political cover. We also end up in much better shape on the border than we were 3 months ago. Again, the bill didn't pass. I'm glad it didn't. It would have been worse than doing nothing. But they didn't get a bill to supposedly secure the border, and he's happy about it? He's got a big old Cheshire cat grin on his face. We were playing chess, they were playing checkers. We got exactly what we wanted. $60 billion to secure another country's border, and we can keep our border wide open. We can allow this flood of illegal migrants coming to this country because we don't care. We want an open border. We know we caused this problem. All we want is political cover, and we got it. We're in a lot better shape. Passing nothing, not strengthening the president's authority to close the border, not having an enforcement mechanism to force President Biden, who wants an open border, to use the authority to secure the border. No, they got a bill that they're going to bring up again. It will fail. They're going to play political theater. They're going to use political cover, and they're just happy as a lark. They think they have political cover. I am hoping that the American public is paying attention to this charade, to this political theater, and recognize that President Biden and his colleagues in the Democrat Congress want an open border. They caused this problem, and they will do nothing to secure it. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Ranking member, we're going to adhere strictly to the 7 minutes so that everybody gets a chance, and then we'll come back for another round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By the way, there's an ongoing investigation as one of the primary excuses always used to prevent disclosure to Congress. So chalk that up to another one from the workshop. Comment on Fagan. Did I hear you right? You testified that you've turned all the documents over to the committee?
We have been working in good faith with the committee, rolling production of documents. We began this process last summer, added people and resourcing to ensure that we're able to get into a regular production of documents. This is an unprecedented undertaking for the organization. There were just short of 2 million pages of documents that were initially looked at with regard to potentially being responsive to the issues that the subcommittee is interested in. We have turned over 18,000 pages of documents to the subcommittee responsive to the ask. That includes 91 reports of investigation from assaults that occurred at the Coast Guard Academy. I understand and we have done this consistent with advice from the General Counsel, consistent with protection of victim privacy and victim dignity, witness privacy, sensitive public health information, attorney-client privilege, and the pre-deliberation or pre-decisional documents. Okay, in those cases where the committee, we have offered in-camera review. It's a standing and open offer for in-camera review. Any one of the documents that you have, we welcome the opportunity to continue to work in good faith with the committee to provide the documents.
So, Bob, we haven't received all the documents.
You've received.
We have not received all the documents. They're still going under review.
We have completed the review. You've received all of the responsive documents.
One of the documents, and I asked you when we first met in my office, showed you an email. There was an attachment to that email. The attachment wasn't provided, and you made the commitment to provide us that attachment. I believe what that was an earlier version of the report, an earlier draft of the report on Operation Fouled Anchor. You committed to provide that. That has not been provided to us, correct?
Well, we'll work back through your committee. I know you've got the Fouled Anchor report, the final report.
Okay. Again, part of our investigation would be to see earlier drafts in terms of what, again, I view this as a cover-up. So when you're investigating a cover-up, some of the documents you're going to want is, okay, we see the final report from a 5-year investigation. You know, we're aware of the fact that that initial report, the initial draft, was 11 pages. It would be very interesting, I think, important for us to see what was cut out of that 11 pages to produce a 6-page report. So when can we expect to see the original drafts, the 11-page initial draft of the report?
I continue to work with my general counsel and am taking advice with regard to
what excuse would be given to not turn over the initial draft of the report? If you want to be fully transparent. What could
I
possibly
continue
prevent
to
that
work
from
in
happening?
good faith with the committee to provide documents, and will provide
Again, good
in-camera
faith is
review.
always the excuse you hear. Who do you report to?
I report to Secretary Mayorkas.
Have you spoken to Secretary Mayorkas about this situation?
Yes.
What kind of interest has she shown in, let's face it, in this cover-up?
This is not a cover-up. I am committed to providing documents in good faith. This is an incredible organization, and I am committed to bringing the organization forward and making the culture change necessary, and I understand that there's a responsiveness to the committee. I remain committed to that, and I continue to work with my own lawyers and the department to ensure that we are providing documents consistent with executive branch and constitutional, the constitutional process with regard to accommodation.
Again, you have to understand, I've heard this time and time again over multiple investigations. It's the exact same excuses given all the time in terms of not being responsive. You talk about 2 million pages. Well, we've already cut it down to somewhere between 25 and 30. You've turned over 17, but in particular, when there's a document that you request, from a U.S. Senator to the Commandant of the Coast Guard, and the Commandant of the Coast Guard said, yeah, we'll provide that document, and it's not provided. And again, I'm not talking 2 million pages. I'm not talking 25,000 pages. I'm talking about an 11-page initial draft of the report on an investigation that took 5 years, that was then covered up for a number of years, and I can't get that 11 pages. We can't get that 11 pages. Why?
I remain committed.
Have you read that full 11-page draft report?
I have not read the pre-decisional 11-page report. I have read the final fouled anchor report that was closed out in February of 2020.
You haven't been inquisitive enough to read the initial draft?
I am focused on...
There's obviously a reason I want to see it. There's obviously a reason I'm making a point of it in this hearing. I think it could be very revealing in terms of what the Coast Guard, at that point in time, decided, well, we don't want to include that. That might harm our institution. That might be embarrassing. So let's leave that out. We'll give them these 6 pages. We'll leave these 5 pages out. So if I get nothing out of this hearing today, is I'd like a complete commitment to show us that full 11-page draft report. If we have to review it in camera, fine. I can go read 11 pages in camera. It's a little more difficult to do another 10 or 20,000 pages. That's why we need these documents here, so that, we can search them. We can get them on our computer. We can search for key phrases. I mean, there's a way you do these investigations. In-camera reviews is not a very good way of doing it, but I'll make an exception for these 11 pages. Can I get that commitment?
I will commit to providing those 11 pages in camera review.
Okay, thank you.
Senator